Good afternoon. Welcome to the World Heart Federation HeartCafe. Today's topic is on single pill combination, the roadmap that was just released by the World Heart Federation. I'm going to be leading as a moderator. My name is Tom Gaziano. I'm a cardiologist from the Brigham Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. I've served on the board of the World Heart Federation for 8 years and led its science committee for 2 years. I shared co-chairing the polypill with Adriana Murphy and Habib Gamra as we put together this over the last couple of years, the evidence and the challenges around how we can move forward with a single pill combination, or you may think about the term polypill or fixed dose combination. We may get into some of the discussions on the terminology later. But first, I want to just introduce the idea what the Heart Cafe is here. We want people to come in and take seats in the front here, please. Come in, come closer. People have to come in and have some seats here. This is it. There's at a meeting like this, there's 30,000 people around here. There's different types of venues. You have the main auditorium, 5,000 people that are having a didactic experience primarily with one speaker sharing their data. We have some of the ESC25 interviews. Again, it's somebody asking somebody, but there's not as much audience participation. This is a cafe. It's a conversation. So it's not just a didactic experience, but it is enriched by your participation in this meeting. So we are going to begin talking about the polypill, or the fixed dose combination, or in this roadmap, the single pill combination. It's special. This particular Heart Cafe is special for two reasons. Heart Cafes are the WHF's representation, or its way that it communicates with the world. The WHF has a goal to be so that every human being has access to the cardiovascular care that the scientists and clinicians and people have worked to put out and make it available, and the policymakers. We're about translating that science into policy and making sure that everybody has access to these wonderful advances. So that's the goal of the WHF, and it wants to fill in a niche at these kinds of meetings to convene people to discuss these conversations. So this is an intimate conversation with authors of one of the other pieces. Another major focus of the WHF is producing these roadmaps. The roadmaps are the way the World Heart Federation takes the science of guidelines, or the advances in science, whether it's use of AI or use of different technologies as part of another roadmap, or the guidelines around hypertension. And then how do we adopt that science, those technologies, those policies into active policy in our communities, in our homes, so that everybody has access to that. But we have a treat today. In addition, one of the other major activities of the World Heart Federation is the producer of new leaders. The Emerging Leaders Program has been in activity for many years, 10th, 11th year now. And we have graduates from last year's class who focused on this topic of polypill. And we're going to have, first of all, speaking to the authors of the guideline and the roadmap. And then we're going to speak to the emerging leaders who are actually putting it together and putting it in place around topics of availability, affordability, and adoption. And there were 3 groups at that meeting that focused, and they're going to share with you what they're doing as a group in their communities all around the world. And so this is very special that we're highlighting 2 different facets of the World Heart Federation: the roadmaps, guiding science into policy, and how we actually overcome those barriers that are in the roadmaps. You can see here, this is an example, a summary that are floating around here of the roadmaps. The roadmap has now been published in Global Heart, and so you have access to that as well. But let's begin with the conversation. So first of all, I want to introduce Enrico Ferro, who served as one of the 2 lead authors of the roadmap. He's a cardiologist and training in electrophysiology at the Beth Israel Hospital, one of the Harvard-affiliated hospitals in Boston. Adriana Murphy served as a co-chair with me from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Dr. Habib Gamra from Les Oliviers Medical Center in Tunisia. Enrico, let's start with you. I think when we want to talk about the policies and enacting new technology, we want to know, does it work? What can you tell us about the polypills, how they work, maybe some of the evolution, and how they compare to traditional therapy of individual medicines?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to this Heart Cafe. So the idea of a polypill, as you were saying, in terms of evolution, first came in the early 2000s when Walden Law came up with the idea of one single pill to treat multiple cardiovascular conditions. So whether it's high blood pressure, high cholesterol, platelet activation, coronary disease. And so that's the inception of the idea. And it works by combining all the medications with the goal of treating multiple risk factors at the same time. So since the inception of the idea, several years have passed and a lot of randomized clinical trials have been conducted, and they will cover in a moment. But that ultimately all led in August of 2023 to the introduction of a polypill for cardiovascular disease treatment and prevention in the essential medicine list of the WHO, which is an important landmark that was, in a way, a point of interest for the WHF. It was behind the advocacy that made this possible. And so with the roadmap, we're now trying to provide evidence and guidelines for implementation. So in terms of the evidence, there is 3 areas of interest, namely, does a polypill increase adherence to treatment? Does it increase the risk factor management, so decrease blood pressure, decrease cholesterol level, and so on? And lastly, does it decrease actual cardiovascular endpoints, heart attacks, cardiovascular mortality, and so on? I'll start with the answer. The answer is yes to all 3. Now, just to put some numbers to take home today, when it comes to adherence, there is several trials that have studied the polypill, both primary and secondary prevention, versus taking the individual pills. And overall, in primary prevention, there is a absolute improvement in adherence by about 10%. Because adherence to single pills could be as low as like 60% and can be as high as 80% with a single pill. Adherence tends to be better for secondary prevention because if you have had a heart attack, that stroke, that's a powerful reminder to taking your meds. Nonetheless, it's still better with a polypill. When it comes to blood pressure, cholesterol, so the biomarkers, as I said, the answer is yes. In primary prevention, the polypill compared to, let's call it standard of care, so exercise, smoking cessation, and so on, still causes a reduction in blood pressure by about 10 to 15 points in systolic blood pressure and about 15 to 30 milligrams per deciliter of LDL levels. So both clinically and statistically significant. When it comes to secondary prevention, the benefits are smaller, about 1 to 2 of systolic blood pressure and about 5 of LDL cholesterol. But you have to put that into context. The adherence, as we just said, is much better in secondary prevention. Again, that powerful reminder to take the meds, so the delta is going to be a little bit smaller. Nonetheless, clinically significant. And lastly, going to MACE, so major adverse cardiovascular events, there is 3 very large trials in the primary prevention space that were pulled together in a meta-analysis over 15,000 patients and over 4 years of follow-up across 10 low and middle income countries and 10 high income countries, so incredibly representative. And that found about a 30-40% relative risk reduction in major adverse cardiovascular event and a 10% relative risk reduction in cardiovascular death. Secondary prevention, we have recently the SECURE trial, which is about 2,500 patients and about 3 years of follow-up. Patients now secondary prevention, so they had an MI, a heart attack, about 6 months before enrollment, and still about a 25% relative risk reduction in MACE. So I would say there is plenty of clinical evidence that's telling us that we should adopt a polypill for primary and secondary prevention across adherence, biomarkers, and actual endpoints.
Wow, that's the evidence, and there should be no reason why we're not all taking them, any of us. But we're not. We had evidence 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that blood pressure medicines work. The individual components of this, aspirin, lipids. Adriana, you've been involved in studying health systems, equity. What, to you, are the challenges between adopting in a health system? Because it's not just the science, but it's how do we get people to take this? And can you share some of these challenges from your experience?
Sure. So, I mean, that's a difficult question, and I wouldn't try to lump all health systems in all low and middle income countries together. Certainly, there's probably people here who work in settings that I don't, and I'd love to hear from you about the barriers in your settings. But from where we do work, what we've seen is predominantly one of the biggest issues is simply resources and financial resources within the health system. A lot of countries, especially in low-income countries, they have essential benefit packages or essential medicine lists, but those are often aspirational, and they simply don't have the money to buy everything on there. And, you know, for example, in some places we work, in Kenya, there are often some facilities that don't even have the single individual pills. And in a lot of those places, so a lot of the medications for other conditions or diseases, infectious diseases largely, have been historically provided by external funding, by donors or special programs like the Global Fund, for example. But domestic financing sources are simply not great enough to cover NCD medications. And so I think as researchers, there are things that we can do. Those that work in health financing, for example, look at this problem from a broader point of view, not just for single pill combinations, but for medicines in general and for health systems in general, and look at ways of sustainable financing for low-income health systems. And the NCD Alliance has done really important work in that area. They've published a report on various approaches to sustainable financing for NCDs in low-income settings, things around taxation, for example, of unhealthy products. But we can also be providing more evidence for these health systems that allows them to prioritize. So with limited resources, why should they be prioritizing single pill combinations over other medications or over individual pills for certain populations? And I know, for example, Tom's done a lot of economic evaluations, including for single pill combinations, but we need more work like that in individual settings, I think.
Habib, you've been working in different environments. Can you tell us from the clinical perspective, Tunisia or experience broader, what are the challenges that a provider needs to have the confidence to prescribe and the patients to want to take on this new approach?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. First of all, I would like to thank WHF to be involved in this very important roadmap. It was a pleasure working with all of you. So I will be talking about North Africa because this is a different setting from the rest of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, in North Africa, SPC has been used in the recent years, but only for hypertension. But it's not widely used, and again, there are many challenges and many obstacles why it's not widely used. First of all, I think awareness. So health professionals are not all aware of the benefit of SPC, but also of the availability of SPC in the market. So they use on a daily basis what they have been using for years, and this is maybe an opportunity in order to push all of us to promote this roadmap among the health professionals all over the world, and particularly in limited resources countries, because I think, because it's cost effective, because it should be more accessible, and it will solve a big issue, which is medication adherence. It's a real important problem in Africa. So patients in Africa, if they don't have the money at the end of the month to buy their drugs, because there are multiple drugs, they will just stop the medication. So again, if we disseminate the information, this will be most widely used, and I think it will be very beneficial for the community. So the first thing is awareness. Second challenge is cost. You know, we have conducted a trial with Salim Youssef a few years ago, but it was published last year in the Lancet. And surprisingly, in high-income countries, the comparison of SPC versus individual drugs was neutral in terms of cost effectiveness, but it was not very beneficial in limited resources countries. And the reason is, I think, the results of that trial has to be taken very carefully, because comparison of individual drugs and SPC agent was not made very rigorously, meaning that you might compare one drug from original drug and you compare it with 3 individual drugs which are generics and therefore cheaper. And it will end up by having the SPC more expensive. So we have to be very careful. But theoretically, SPC should be cheaper than having 3 drugs, of course. The other issue that we're having is that's health professionals' inertia. And the reason for that is, again, awareness, but secondly, because health professionals are very reluctant to deal with these three drugs because we don't have the different dosage combinations. It's much easier for the health professional to deal with one drug, take one pill, two pills, half pill, rather having three drugs together and then try to play around with that. So this requires thinking and sometimes from health professional in order to use appropriately these agents. So these are some challenges, but I think one solution to that would be to try to push the insurance companies to include the use of SPC as a reimbursement criteria. So you have to use SPC in order to be reimbursed. So this might be a solution to that, and of course, improve awareness among health professionals.
Thank you, Habib. And so you brought up an issue that's important for on the cost effectiveness. Thank you, Adriana, for the shout out. But Enrico, can you talk to us a little bit in terms of in the roadmap, what we should interpret from the cost effectiveness in the literature that we have, and some of the challenges between interpreting that in high income versus a low income country setting?
That's a great question. Maybe I'll take one moment to bring everybody on the same field in terms of cost effectiveness. So earlier we talked about efficacy, so the clinical results, and then now we add one more axis, which is cost. So if you do a ratio of the two, you may have more benefit, which we talked about from a clinical perspective, but then the new polypill can be more expensive or less expensive than the standard of care, so the single pills. So of course, if it was a polypill more effective and less expensive and your cost savings, that's amazing. That would be easy to adopt and to make a case. In most cases, however, the new technology, at least at first, while there is patents and so on, tends to be more expensive. And so more benefit for more cost. So that's where cost effectiveness comes into place. Now, every country or every health system has a willingness to pay for that benefit. And usually that has been defined as about 1 to 3 times the per person or per capita gross domestic product. So those are the numbers that we use in these type of references. So I mentioned to you before for primary prevention was 3 large randomized trials. Well, they have been pulled together and now to look at cost effectiveness. And what was found in primary prevention is that the polypill compared to individual therapies has a cost effectiveness ratio of about $5,000 per quality of adjusted life years saved. Well, what does that number mean? If we take the average per capita GDP of low to middle income country, that's about $10,000 per quality. So even if you were to go at half that, you're still cost effective. What's even more incredible if you look at high income countries where that cost effectiveness ratio is $700 per quality of adjusted life years improvement. And if you think about a country like the United States, the per capita GDP is $80,000. If you look at Europe, that's $45,000. So you're several orders of magnitude below the willingness to pay. And so one could think, those are great numbers. What can we do next? Well, I think it's helpful for policymakers to put these numbers in reference to things that are widely adopted and non-controversial. So if you think about care for heart attacks, whether it's for the diagnosis of chest pain or treatment with stents, the cost effectiveness of those interventions is at least 10 times higher, let's say $7,000+ than the 700 of a polypill. And the polypill is going to treat the risk factors and reduce heart attacks. So it's just a virtuous cycle that really needs to be at the forefront. And to your point, we need to just circulate this data, make everyone aware of what opportunity there is there from a cost effectiveness perspective.
Very good, Enrico. And just one final question for you. If you can briefly tell us, we've been talking about where we are now. There are new technologies coming on, and hopefully I think some of our next panelists will talk about some of this and using either digital health or other approaches to this question. What can we do in that space?
Right, so that's the other big question, and I think it's a nice segue into the point that was made earlier about flexibility and provider inertia, because I think right now, if you think about 3 types of agents, blood pressure medication, statins, aspirin, and if you start combining them, you get to a very high level of combination, and so increasing the personalization of treatment, I think, is going to be an important next step to increase the adoption and make it accessible to patients in their home. so that in the era of personalized medicine, poly pills are no exception, and making sure that each patient, each provider can identify a poly pill that contains exactly the combination that's needed for that patient to make them more adherent and also to make it more tolerable, less risk of side effects and so on. So I think that's what can be next to promote adoption and use.
Thanks. Adriana, we talked about health systems. Now we want to move a little bit to some, WHF is interested, I think most people are interested in reducing sort of inequities. How do countries use the roadmap to reduce rather than increase inequities? Is the roadmap going to be such that high-income people in low-income countries have access? Or what can we do about that?
Thanks. Well, there are a few things that we talk about in the roadmap as potential solutions to overcoming barriers to access, and obviously ensuring equity in access. A few of those things I can talk about that would reduce or would focus on reducing inequities both between countries and then within countries. Between countries, we talk a little bit about pooled procurement in the roadmap, and where individual countries maybe don't have the resources or the sort of buying power, let's say purchasing power or negotiation power on their own. It's a shame I don't think Pedro Ordóñez is here from the Pan American Health Organization, but they did this with antihypertensives. PAHO supported a strategic fund to do pooled procurement. Some people question how realistic it is elsewhere, but that's for another conversation. There are things like voluntary licensing where new medical technologies or SPCs are patented. Companies can provide voluntary licenses to generic manufacturing companies to provide that patented drug for limited markets, so very poor countries, for example. So that's potentially some of the ways to address inequities between countries. And then within countries, I talked about essential medicine lists and the importance of having the single pill combination on essential medicine list, because in the public sector, those are the drugs that are provided free of care, so they're not just available for people who want to pay out of pocket. And including those medications in essential medicine lists, but also in covered benefit packages is very important. And then finally, one of the things that I think is, we've talked about prescriber inertia. We can do a lot in disseminating this roadmap at ESC and other cardiology conferences, but the people in the poorest places of the poorest countries are not being prescribed medications often by cardiologists who go to ESC. So I think in our efforts to educate prescribers, we have to be doing that in the most remote places of the poorest settings to ensure that the clinicians and the healthcare providers in those settings have an understanding of what drugs are available and why it's important to prescribe what to different populations, and then of course, where possible, to also educate patients themselves.
Habib, I think you alluded to this question, before when I was talking to you, but as the WHF, because we mentioned translating science into policy, it includes not just cardiologists, but other policymakers or civil society advocating for certain changes in their country or the region. For North Africa, what do you want civil society, cardiologists, primary care physicians, as Adriana says, whoever might be prescribing this, what policy change do you think move the needle most for your region?
Well, important question. My personal wish is, when we go back from USC, and when you go to a meeting, colleagues will be presenting talks. They will be saying, we saw the recent guidelines of USC on valvular heart disease, on dyslipidemia, but what I personally wish that they would say, that people they would start saying, there was the recent WHF roadmaps about SPC that needs to have the same scientific value and power in changing the practice of physicians. This is one important move if we can make it. So this is something that needs to be, encouraged, and they will change. I'm sure people are very sensitive in talks, in meetings, to see guidelines, ACC, HA, USC, but we need to have the WHF roadmap too. Now, we have also to work on health policies in national systems. And national societies play a big role. For example, in Tunisia, the Ministry of Health, to change the system in any way, even reimbursement, they will go back to the national society and ask them, what do you think? What is the recent evidence? What are the recent guidelines? So also, I think the relationship between WHF and national societies should be reinforced so that national societies, they will be also aware of WHF roadmaps and, of course, trying to change the practice based on that. One other thing, again, the reimbursement system is an important component in changing practice. And again, I'm talking about North Africa, the insurance always go back to the national society to ask them what should be reimbursed, what should not be reimbursed. So I'm saying almost the same thing, but I think going back and trying to reinforce the place of these roadmaps in national societies and national systems is absolutely key to change the clinical practice.
Thank you. So I've mentioned at the beginning, this is a conversation. So I'm looking out and I'm expecting to see somebody's hand lift up like this. This is how we do this. Somebody, I want an audience question. Elijah.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys, for providing the leadership and having this document finally out. I think probably the other challenging issue which hasn't quite come out yet is that we can convince prescribers, we can convince policymakers, but we actually have to have products in the market. And the products being in the market is a function largely of industry. And this is where sort of the subtle difference between polypill and single pill combination comes in. Single pill combinations are quite widely available, especially in hypertension. Diabetes is getting there. So I think one of the challenges we collectively have is how do we get industry to see this as something which is viable? Because obviously industry has got commercial interest. And there's a bit of a chicken and the egg situation. Do we create the demand for them to, to manufacture, or do we convince them to manufacture so that we can convince prescribers and policymakers to recommend? So I think that's another important dimension that we need to look at.
I want to go off script here. Dr. Rogers? So we have one of the world's experts in understanding these questions about availability, the challenges in drug production in this space. And I'm going to, if the panel does not mind, I'm going to go off script and ask you to come in to comment a little bit about some of the questions. Elijah's raising these questions about, we have the evidence, we have people maybe having the willingness, but product is not available. If not, maybe in some places, but certainly not everywhere. Can you want to speak to some of those general challenges and what we need to think about in terms of overcoming that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. So, as always, I think it's a multifaceted issue, but one of the key ones is the regulatory barriers are still fairly significant, and rightly or wrongly, they differ per country, per region, and so that's quite a hard hurdle for manufacturers. But I think the most important thing by far is the lack of pull. So, if you want particularly generics manufacturers or manufacturers that are interested in high volume, low margin supply, they've got to have some certainty that the market is going to be worth it. And at the moment, it's this vicious circle where if there's not enough sales, then people don't expect there'll be sales. But if there were purchasers who are saying, if you make it this much at this price, we'll buy this much of it, they don't actually have to spend any money, they just have to give the intention. I think that would be a game changer.
Okay. So thank you, Anthony. Dr. Rogers from the George Institute, and again, a leader in this field, and we're honored to have you here with us. So I wanted to, Aviv mentioned something at the very end of his comments, and it was about power and we need that kind of power. And I think the WHF has introduced a program to create that power, which is developing new leadership. And so what I'd like to do is ask the first part of the panel to sit down and bring in the new power, the new leadership of world cardiovascular disease. So we have three emerging leaders who are, maybe that's a misnomer, they're leaders. They just got that moniker from participating in a WHF event, spending a week or so with unfortunately people like us stuck with us, trying to give them some inspiration when they actually inspired us. So please come up, and I want to share, and I think you, Anthony, also mentioned, sort of quote, I think, from Dante, sort of these vicious circles. So hopefully there's some virtuous circles that we can talk about as well. But it is this conundrum of whether it's chicken and egg, affordability, availability, adoption, which one is leading those. These three speakers are going to come up and talk about each of those projects and what we can do to address those, nudging them perhaps all along. Hopefully maybe that we can get some virtual sort of cycle going on. But would you guys come up? Thank you.
Thank you.
So while they're taking their seat, I'm just going to remind, I'm doing research in South Africa, and I'm working with psychologists, neurologists, oncologists, endocrinologists, and infectious disease doctors on looking at the interaction of these different diseases in South Africa and how they might affect, from my perspective, cardiovascular disease and vice versa, how these interplay. One of the things they always say is that you cardiologists always have the best acronyms for your studies. You just are so good at it. And so we're going to see some further evidence of this right now. So Alexander Perkins is going to talk about Aspect Africa and really focusing on, remember we talk about availability, adoption, affordability. They have names, but this is sort of the principles that they're representing. So share with us your great trial name and what your group is tackling and what's been going on over the year.
Yeah, fantastic, Tom. Thanks very much, and it's a real pleasure to be able to talk about the work we're doing as part of our project from the Emerging Leaders. And I'm happy to give the update on the Aspect Africa, and just to note that it's a collaborative of 7 different leaders. Some of them are here in the audience. I know some other people are at the conference, so I'm happy to give the update on behalf. So I think it links really nicely into the last question that came up from Prof. Agola, and then Anthony Rogers was talking about availability and trying to create the demand for single pill combination therapy. So what we did, and we were given the topic of availability, is we wanted to really drive in and make sense of, in 2 countries where SPCs are on the EML, what was preventing those pills from getting into people's mouths, from getting into the market. And so we wanted to look at the supply chain barriers and facilitators all the way from, if they're available, they're licensed and they're imported or they're manufactured locally, what's stopping them from getting all the way through the supply chain out into the clinic and directly to the patients. So that's what we came up, and it's a 3-phase study. What we're doing, and we're focusing in 2 countries, in Uganda and in Nigeria, where 2 of the members are based, and so it kind of gave us a nice case study to work there. The first part we're doing is a bit of a literature review to map out that supply chain in both countries. And then using that kind of draft map, we're conducting some interviews with key stakeholders in both countries to help us kind of really identify a list of the barriers and facilitators, like what's preventing the medication from reaching people or what's helping it from getting to people. And then at the end of that, we want to use those results to kind of feedback with people in both countries and develop a draft framework which helps guide discussions around increasing availability of SPCs in both settings. So it's been a productive year. It's a really interesting experience working kind of with a very distributed team across the globe. We kind of go all the way from Australia to Brazil, so scheduling meetings has been a challenge. But we're really pleased with the progress so far. So that first phase in terms of mapping out the supply chain is underway with the literature review, and so we're doing kind of the extraction and drafting that now. So we're pleased with that progress. And then in both countries, and preparing for the key informant interviews to kind of take that draft and refine it and help us to really understand what the local barriers and facilitators are. We have provisional ethics approval in both countries, and so we're hoping to start that work in the next few months coming up as well.
So thank you. So you mentioned 2 different things. One is, or 3 things I want to say is, outside of the topic, you're exposed to being thrown into a group of people that you hadn't met before and asked to come up with a project. And then you're having some of dealing with challenges of doing research and conducting research, getting approval for the study, launching them, dealing with time zones across, 14 hours or something you may have described. So tell us how have you overcome those barriers, and what's that experience been like?
Yeah, I think that the initial sort of very intense think tank that we had in Mombasa as part of the Emerging Leaders Program last November really helped us kind of set the team a bit, and it gave us the platform then to work on. Obviously this kind of work it wouldn't be possible without all the modern technologies, and so we're always on WhatsApp and stuff to communicate and help bring it together. And also then really structuring out the roles and responsibilities, and that's been a challenge and something we're working to achieve, and to ensure that people have a clear idea of what their ownership within the team is, and then who has availability to help support them, so we can deliver that work. But yeah, it's been a fascinating thing to go through, but a really nice chance, and that's why I think, not to sound like a real company man, but the Emerging Leaders Program is so effective and valuable, is it gives you that chance to really solidify some new connections and then have a chance to run with them. And I think those are kind of connections that we'll be relying on for a long time to come.
You'll get the company bonus. Hyman, would you like to share a little bit about Kinga, and then maybe afterwards some of your experience in using new technologies and new ways to educate people about adoption?
Thanks. Thanks, Prof. Tom. Yeah. So I'm from the adoption team. So in our team, we have a very special name, Kinga, which is a Kenyan name. So our group mainly to target the previous challenge that our speakers have mentioned, which is the physician's inertia in prescribing single-pill combination. So in our study, the main aim is to develop, implement, and evaluate online educational modules to educate prescribers, aiming to improve their knowledge and attitude in prescribing single-pill combinations. So there are two phases in our project. So the first phase is the development phase, where we used information from the previous World Heart Federation SPC survey. So we identified the knowledge gap and learning needs from the prescribers. So from that survey, we managed to identify three main scopes that we will cover for the e-learning modules. So the first one would be the challenges of CVD prevention, highlighting the needs of SPCs in CVD prevention. The second module is we will focus on the efficacy of SPC in primary and secondary prevention, using the information from the World Heart Federation roadmap. So the third one, we would wish to provide practical guidance to the prescribers, mainly to address their concerns and also educate them on how to prescribe the SPCs. So in this e-learning module, we would like to have a very interactive multimedia e-learning modules and pack it into 10 to 15 minutes per module so that it is more feasible and more accessible for busy cardiologists and clinicians. So we use co-creation, learner-centric approach where we will engage with the prescribers to refine our content so that they are relevant to their clinical practice. So for the second phase is the implementation and evaluation phase. So we will test it out in Kenya. So we will implement and disseminate the modules via the health institutions and also professional providers, societies such as the Kenya Cardiac Societies. So we will look at the effectiveness and also the implementations, looking at how well the modules reach the prescribers, the target populations, the physicians, cardiologists, and primary care physicians. We look at how effective the e-learning modules in improving their knowledge and attitude in SPC's prescription. We also look at the adoptions from the institutions and also the societies, whether they adopt this to implement it, and also looking at the fidelity of how prescribers using the e-learning modules. Are they able to complete it? And looking at sustainability of the module as well. So with this project, our vision is we hope we can contribute to improve the uptake and utilizations of SPCs. And our module is designed in such a way that they are adaptable and reusable in other countries. Especially it's useful later on to implement in other countries, especially LMICs, which has the similar challenges in SPCs. Yeah.
So, thank you. And I think we had the pleasure of the advantage of hearing some more of your discussion in Mombasa about the changes in educational theory and how we educate providers. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and what are you doing that's different than what might have been done 20 years ago in terms of educating providers, and why or how that's effective?
Yeah, so one thing about educating clinicians, the challenge that we have is how the educations and the knowledge that they gain will be able to change their practice. So we have this IKAP theory where how the informations change their the knowledge, attitude, and subsequently the practice of the providers. But of course, traditionally the education sometimes is difficult to reach to other populations, especially the rural populations in the LMIC's countries. And sometimes when the education is too big or too huge a size and the attentions and how much they can get is not that effective. So with the e-learning technologies that we have, so we were able to make it more concise so that the informations and the knowledge can be delivered in a more effective way so that hopefully they can change their prescribing behavior.
Thank you. All right, so the next, Wagner Madrini, who has, again, gone from emerging leader to leader. Yesterday he presented his trial that he was involved in Brazil on single pill combinations. So congratulations on that, first of all. Wonderfully positive trial. You're here, but not talking about the medication that you were working with, except you may want to make sure that it's affordable. And so REACH SPC, reviewing essential affordability criteria for high impact single pill combination. Tell me about that project and how it's going.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Tom. It's a really pleasure to be here with all of you and see those familiar faces again. I'm really happy to be here with you. So we are discussing about how to make single pill combination available for everyone. And in our group, we understand that an important step for that is to include an essential medicine list. So this one is of the key drivers to make single pill available. So what we are trying to do ultimately is to support the countries to help countries to include single pill combination in EML. So basically, we are trying to develop some questionnaires directed to policymakers and trying to understand which variables they use to include a single pill medication in an essential medicine list. So we developed a specific questionnaire and we're going to apply in 4 countries, in India, in Kenya, South Africa, and Argentina. And we are applying those documents. And the idea is once we gather all those information, we can support and help other countries to facilitate the process of include a single pill combination in EML. So basically, we are finished to this questionnaire. We are applying for this policymaker now, and we are expecting to have the answer back soon. So once you can understand better this process of submitting single pill medication in an EML.
So anybody from those 4 countries that knows people in the ministry, please let Wagner know so that you can help them. Because I think, have you had challenges reaching out to the policymakers you want, or has that been successful?
Fortunately, we got a powerful people in our group, so they are really well related, and they got the access to talk with those people. So it was great. It was great. I guess in Argentina, Gonzalo, that was one of our participants, have a close contact with Minister of Health, so that would really help us.
Very good. So now I'm going to open up questions to these 3 panelists plus the previous 3. So I need some hands up. Do you have a hand? Bruce, are you trying to do some exercise there? No? Okay, just listening. Okay.
Yeah, great projects, and just a question to you and your colleague working in Africa. What is the channel for you to access, to make research in Africa? You know, the context in Africa for making research is quite challenging. And I'm suggesting to you maybe to go through the national societies in order to, try to alleviate the challenges that you might come across when you conduct these kinds of projects in African countries. I don't know if you have considered that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and to be clear, so for in our group, in the work we're doing, so it's a case study based in Uganda and in Nigeria, and in both countries we have 2 of our team members they're from those countries, and so they're leading the work. And I think that's kind of, I agree with engaging with the professional societies is a really strong way to go. And I think the kind of the foundation of that is having the work led by somebody who's based in that environment anyway. So it's their country, they know the people and they know the systems and they know the priorities. So they're leading it, and then we work to support them as a team. Yeah.
I mean, anything from the Kinga project, would you say that your work is focused in an African country?
Yeah, so when we are focusing on the Kenyan population, the prescribers, we're also targeting those professional societies. So we aim to disseminate it's kind of top-down strategy will be more effective in disseminate the e-learning modules. So we aiming at the Kenya Cardiac Societies and also the internal physician societies in Kenya, so that the implementations of the e-learning modules will be more effective.
Thank you. Bruce, question for anybody, either the first panel or the second.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure who it's for. Potentially it's for any of them, I think. But
Okay.
Obviously some really significant challenges to getting adoption, and obviously lots of variation between settings in terms of what's likely to work and what's not. I guess I was interested to know, are there sort of example settings or example countries that have done this well, or parts of this well, that you're able to, I guess, learn from or leverage from?
Anyone? Adriana, do you want to speak to that?
Do you mean specifically with the single pill combinations? I think no, but I think one of the sort of, we were going to include a case study in the roadmap about PAHO, because they have done it well for antihypertensives. Actually, Andreas is here. He could maybe talk a little bit about that. No?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I work for the Pan American Health Organization with Pedro. Pedro sends you his greetings. He couldn't attend the Congress because other commitments with Johns Hopkins University. In PAHO, we work trying to incorporate single pill combinations, primarily for hypertension treatment, but into a health system approach, not just focusing on the pill, on the drugs, but trying to introduce single pill combination into a health system approach through our main implementation tool, which is the Heart's Clinical Pathway, which contains many different protocols for diagnosing hypertension, for treating hypertension and others related disease. We have faced a lot of challenge with countries to adopt single pill combinations with different reasons. We have worked with countries in the last 4 years to support the single pill combination for treating hypertension into the incorporation of this technology into their national EML, but high cost remains the main barrier to adopt these technologies. I know that when you read cost effectiveness studies, it seems quite obvious, but surprisingly, when you look at the countries, the single pill combinations prices are higher than different single drugs. So I think this is a main barrier to overcome.
So I'm going to add a little bit to that. I mean, so that in the this is perfect advertisement for the document. There is case studies, and I think Bruce, you suggested in answering that we use an example first of all, even before this, the ART in Africa and other places have been able to combine different medications, not necessarily the same in terms of completely different pathways, but putting them into for treatment and it's been very successful in managing and getting viral loads in very low resource settings, extremely low. In the cardiovascular as we mentioned, it's been primarily in blood pressure, and the heart's program here, just the data though, I think I'd say we're primed for it in that sense that there's 17 of the 26 countries in the Latin America and the hearts programs that have SPCs in their, if you're using the term, at least a couple drugs. And then the start in Argentina does have introduction, of a polypill. And then, 24 countries recommending initiating treatment with at least 2 of the antihypertensives. So I think that there is, and then even use of higher dose statins, I think it's sort of trickling down to where there was resistance in those countries. So perhaps we're on that threshold of getting that. I don't know if either Anthony or somebody else may have some comments or questions on this, is that because it's maybe to comment on generic medications, if they're using generic components, what is it that makes it potentially more expensive, and what might make it less expensive than individual components of generics, meaning not just the combinations of the medicines themselves, but potentially even prescribing patterns of 3 months rather than 1 month, the pharmaceutical sort of cost of distributing 3 different bottles versus 1 bottle. I don't know how much of that has come into play in the discussion around the affordability as one of the barriers. Have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's nothing intrinsically, unless there's a very complicated formulation, which isn't usually the case, why they should be that much more expensive. Yeah, and the most affordable total system of care way to supply is 3, or I think it'd be really interesting to look even at 6-month dispensing of single pill combinations. But it's really a market pull reason why combinations are, companies tend to work on, if it's a low volume, I have to put the price up. If you can give me a high volume, I'll give you a low price. And that's the world you're in. Yeah.
So where's the sort of the global fund type of approach then to help with those prices? Is it the wrong economic time, the wrong political time to introduce that? And that's the question to anybody. Anthony?
It's a pretty bad time. But I think even before what's happened recently, people have been very interested in not being dependent on a donation-based supply, but having something that's self-sustaining. And I would say a key thing would be for proactive purchasing from ministries of health, and instead of buying a smorgasbord of a dozen different choices and 40 different drug dose combinations, a much simpler drug purchasing policy would be sensible.
And who would be then the convener for those purchasing decision makers? Is it regional WHO offices? Is it coming from somewhere else? Is it coming from WHF or ESC, or it's an interesting idea. I wonder who would the convener be?
I mean, the ultimate decision is always at a country level. The Ministry of Finance and Department of Health, what they actually spend their money on, but I'm sure technical advice from those organizations would help a lot, and modeling scenarios, but also practical examples of just how low costs you could get if you made concrete demand, requests for volumes out to generics manufacturers at home and abroad.
Any other questions, or have you comment?
I have 2 questions for everyone to try to think about. Do you think that there are now industry companies who are not happy about the dissemination of SPCs because they want to sell 3 drugs instead of 1? And in terms of finances, they will make more money keeping individual drugs rather than SPC. I don't know if that's true, but that's my feeling. The other question is, how about educating health professionals, of course, about the benefit of SPCs, but educate patients too, because patients, they love SPC. They will ask you, we're fed up of having too many drugs. Why don't you give us 1 drug instead of 3? And in the original system in Tunisia, in terms of reimbursement, if the patients accept to pay the difference, it's okay. So even if it is more expensive, there are patients who are ready to pay the difference between, what is reimbursed and what is not. So, just a thought, two thoughts for discussion.
So I just to summarize, I think you addressed some of what Anthony was saying, that part of the pull part, whether it's certainly, I think pharmaceutical companies we couldn't say they're not motivated by profit. That would be crazy for us to not say that and understand that. But I don't think specifically, I think they just don't see that this market is, as I think what Anthony's suggesting at least, as viable yet. If it were profitable, they would move. But I guess the question then is, in the pull sort of frame of creating that demand, is it who can think of an example where it is the patient population, maybe again in HIV, in terms of pushing for having medications. Remember in the 80s, dramatic protests and marches about moving through the NIH process of getting drugs cleared faster, removing regulatory barriers. Maybe that's one part of where we are right now, at least potentially removing some of the regulatory barriers to make it easier for them to be profitable. But must it come from the patient, and how do we get that activated? We can say something different, or you can speak to that.
Well, I guess I wanted to follow up on two of the points that were raised. One, when we all met before, I think last year in Geneva, to talk about what are the goals of this initiative of a roadmap, one issue that came up was that we're yet not doing a good job in forecasting demand. And so, if we go back to the primary prevention population, how many patients would actually need to be served? Which I think adds to your point about you have cost effectiveness, but then you have a budget impact, because it can be cost effective per pill, but how many patients are eligible, what's the budget, and would that make an attractive market for the company to step in? So I feel like that may be a step one, is quantifying demand. Yeah. And I wonder, to your point about, are the companies making more money by selling free separate drugs? My interpretation, and would love to hear other comments, is that they're just facing a big cost to reach the market, because there is a regulatory barriers, there is a manufacturing. I think they're ready to manufacture single pills. If you have to come up with a new manufacturing process, it's a big investment to make for an uncertain supply at the end. So I think these are the items.
I think Wagner reminded us yesterday that there's 1.3 billion people with hypertension. I'm sure a fair number of those people are eligible for a primary prevention polypill. Anthony, do you know actually what that would be if you're using a risk threshold? Well, it's the global potential need.
It all depends on your risk threshold, but it's several hundreds of millions. It's enormous. Shortage of patients is
Seems like that's not the issue. How do we get them to ask for this?
Can I say, Tom, I wonder, just thinking about using the example of antiretrovirals and HIV, I wonder if it kind of starts to fall down here as a case study, because in that case, we're kind of going from none to very little available therapy to having therapy, where in the challenge here, we're getting people to adopt an SPC, is we're going from existing therapies to just a better way and a more efficacious way of taking them. So we're not kind of, maybe the patient demand is not going to drive it, but I wonder it has to kind of come from both the as Anthony was saying, at the kind of the ministry level in terms of the purchasing, and then the patient to sort of meet in the middle. It's not just going to come from a groundswell of patient demand, I would contend.
Yeah. But they did go from single pills and nothing to to single pill combination. Anyone else? A question? You sure? Bruce?
I was just going to make a comment about the ART example. I mean, I'm working in a very different space, which is around sort of sodium reduction, where we sort of failed and wanting to get the world to think about potassium-enriched salt. And we sort of spent we've been going through all the same things, and we're probably behind even where you are, but we found it really useful to look at the last time the world changed its salt supply, which was from regular salt to iodized salt, and what we were able to learn from that process and how that might apply to what we're doing. And we did spend quite a lot of time looking at that and talking to all the people who'd done it, and I'm sure there's lots of analysis of why ART worked, why it worked in some settings and not others, but it does feel like sort of learning from that and leveraging the experience of that might be useful in this setting too.
And maybe we can make them low salt pills as well.
I don't.
Any more questions? Well, I want to thank, on behalf of the World Heart Federation, and also want to Lana for helping to organize this and for guiding us through developing the roadmap. Thank all of you for coming. Thank you for all the speakers emerged, and the faculty. And take it and share it with your friends. Appreciate it.